So this short presentation is going to give you a little bit of information on other tools that you might use to support you when you're dealing with challenging situations with service users. So there's a whole range of different challenging situations that you're going to come across, and these vary in how easy they are to deal with. There's lots more that we could say, but I'm just going to give you some tips and ideas on some things that might be helpful to you in some of these situations. So firstly, one of the things that comes up more and more now as we do more and more telephone and online consultations is how we deal with the communication there. And it's a completely different way of communicating. And rather than talking you through that, I'm going to direct you straight away to a guidance sheet that I've written on Dietcom's training package, which is purely about communication and telehealth. And what it also does is then direct you to further sources of information. So if you click on that link, you'll get the guidance document, which is a couple of sides of A4, giving you some tips and specific things that you might be able to do, but also follow up more detail if you want to. So I'm just going to talk through for the rest of this screencast a couple of skills that can be really useful in particular situation. So we're going to start with something called concreteness, which is what it says in a way. It's making things more concrete, more specific, gaining clarity. And the problem that we often have is that service users can be quite vague. So they may use words like always or everything or everybody all the time. And when we're thinking about food related questions, how often might you have that? Oh, just sometimes, not very often, occasionally, but yeah, quite frequently. And all of those words are extremely vague and not helpful for us when we're trying to get clarity in the situation. So let's think about a possible solution to that. So we want to facilitate our service users to talk as specifically and clearly as possible. And both ourselves and the service user need to be specific. And what this is really important, because if we get lots of vague answers, what we tend to do is kind of put our own ideas, make up our own mind about a situation, make presumptions, rather than actually finding out what is most important to that service user. And this idea of being concrete links with all the skills that you've already learnt. So you can direct concreteness to behaviour. What did you do? What people were thinking about and what they might be feeling. And of course, it's essential with goal setting, which we have already discussed. And the key thing is to remember that if we have a vague situation, we're going to give a vague solution. If we have a vague problem, a vague solution, nothing about that is going to be effective. We're not going to get effective action. So we really need to make sure that we have skills that can help us to get things a little bit clearer. So this idea of concreteness, it's referred to as a compound skill because you apply it to all the skills you already know. So a lot of the skills that you've already learned, the active listening, asking open questions, paraphrasing, reflection of feelings, summarising, all of those can gain clarity, but sometimes we end up with a really vague response. And we haven't really got the clarity of understanding that we need in order to take consultation forward. So it might be that we use open questions to clarify something. So, what happened exactly? When you say people, who specifically are you referring to? Can you give me an example? Which specific foods do you feel are causing you problems? How did you feel? How did you react? What did you find difficult? So we're trying to get a much clearer understanding of what the situation is. So note that these are still open questions. They're not yes/no answers, but they are really quite directive. They are asking people to talk about something very specific, and we can get a lot more clarity by doing that. So try and think about that when you've got someone who's being quite vague. Well, yeah, do sometimes. Um, what does sometimes mean? Your idea of sometimes and their idea of sometimes may be completely different. So asking specific, open but directive questions will help us in those situations. So that's one thing that you can apply to quite a number of situations. And that might also include those situations where a service user has communication difficulties. So you don't want to be too open. You want to make sure that the conversation stays focused to make it easier for them. The other skill I just want to talk about briefly is called immediacy. And sometimes that's used in the context of giving feedback to someone. But what I'm looking at here is a situation where you might need to be a little bit clearer about your role. Now, if you have done EPPE early on in your consultation and you have already explained the role of a dietitian, it might be that this doesn't come up. And it certainly isn't something you're going to need in every consultation, but sometimes you might. So I just want to talk through how that might work. So sometimes you might have explained the role of a dietitian, but your service user may still have an expectation that you can't or don't want to meet. Sometimes it goes beyond the role of the dietitian, but it's something they want to engage with more personally. And if you just reflect and paraphrase back to them, what you could be doing is reinforcing that expectation that you don't want to meet. So there has to be a way out of that. You can't ignore that difference between what they want and what you want. You've got to tackle it. So I'll give you some examples of situations where this might happen. So it could be that someone's expressing a lot of interest in your personal life. And that might be because they're trying to work out whether you're someone who can relate to them. It might also be a distraction. If they're talking about you, then they're not talking about themselves. So sometimes that people use that. Sometimes they're just genuinely interested. But we have lots of time pressures in practice, and therefore talking about you is not an appropriate thing to be doing. And it's also taking time away from when the service user can talk about themselves. So, it could be simple questions, are you married? Do you have children? So if someone's really struggling with their children at the moment, asking if you have children might give them that idea that you'd be better able to understand their situation. They might be interested in how you feel about something. How would you feel in this situation? So if they've got something that they're feeling quite strongly about that's been difficult, for example, they're trying to see, have you got an understanding? Or do you feel the same way that I do? And sometimes they're wanting validation there. So we've got to be really careful that we don't get embroiled in our emotions reflecting theirs, or we may have completely different emotions. So we need to stay focused on reflecting their feelings and distracting them away from what our feelings might be, because our feelings aren't relevant in this situation. Sometimes they're going to be dissatisfied, and that might be because they thought you'd be able to do something that you can't. So they are unhappy because they wanted that thing sorting out, and it turns out you're not going to be able to do it. So there's disappointment there and frustration, which we need to acknowledge with our reflecting of feelings. Sometimes if you've got a family or you've got a couple in front of you, one of them is asking you to take sides. And that's a really difficult thing to do and not appropriate. So again, we've got to distract people from worrying about what we think in order to get back to the purpose of what you're trying to achieve. And sometimes, it's just that someone thinks you can do something that you can't. Can you teach me to cook? Can you take me shopping? Can you show me where to find these things in the supermarket? Believe it or not, sometimes people think we can do that. So there's that kind of boundaries of our role. And as we've discussed that it might be that their boundaries of the role might be they're expecting you to do something that the physio or the OT or someone else might do. So how do we tackle all of this? So this idea of immediacy and role explanation is one way to tackle this type of situation. So what we first want to do is check that we have understood what that person is asking. So I would encourage you to paraphrase so that you're checking that that's what they really meant to say. And quite often people will back down when they realise that's what they've actually asked, or think to themselves, no, I don't suppose you can do that, can you? But check your understanding is what you thought it was. And then we have this thing called a meta conversation. So it's a conversation that is separate almost from the conversation we're having. So you're kind of taking a side step. So we've been in this consultation conversation, and we're going to stop that for a moment and step aside and have a conversation about this situational challenge that you have been given by the service user. So that might be you having to clarify your role. It might be that you want to clarify that actually your feelings on a situation or your personal circumstances aren't relevant to this particular situation. And you want to stay focused on what's relevant to them. So language is really important. It might be, unfortunately, I'm not able to do that in my role, but what we can do is this. Make sure we're using collaborative language, but really be clear and specific if you're being asked to do something that's inappropriate or out of your role. And then check whether that service user is happy with that explanation. And if they're not, then you might want to do a little bit more clarifying of that situation, maybe some specific question there, specific directive question there, to get clarity. But you can't really progress with your consultation until you've resolved this inappropriate situation, whichever way it is. So we need to get back to that focus on the service user's needs, their feelings, their situation, their direction of conversation in order to meet their health needs. So it's just one way. I haven't had to use it very often at all in all the years of working in the health service, but just occasionally it can be really useful just to stop and then get that clarity. And when you go back to, when you've got that clarity and agreement, the best tool to get you back on track with the consultation you had kind of metaphorically left is by summarising where you were up to. So you might then say, well, we had already discussed what had led up to your appointment. We've been talking about your condition and how diet relates to that. We'd begun to discuss where your eating what your eating habits are. Are you happy for us to now go on and talk about what goals might be appropriate for you? So you take it back in. And you've got to obviously remain quite neutral here. You're not being defensive. You're just bringing clarity. And it could be that your EPPE sorts this out, this kind of problem out as well. So both tools are going to be really useful when you are being asked to do something that is perhaps outside of your role.